Who will get there first? The race is on for Anwar Ibrahim and Muhyiddin Yassin, two men hoping to become Malaysia's Prime Minister to form the country's next government. And it seems like Mr. Muhyiddin may have the upper hand. I'm Lynlee Foo. Thanks for joining us on ST Live. As many had predicted, Malaysia's 15th general election has resulted in the country's first ever hung parliament with no clear winner. All day today, the coalitions have been locked in negotiations, trying to come up with the numbers to form the next government. They won't have much time though, as the King has decreed that all parties must declare their coalition partners and name their choice for Prime Minister by 2 p.m. on Monday. Now here's where things stand, with 220 of 222 seats confirmed by the Election Commission. Pakatan Harapan, led by Anwar Ibrahim, has the slight edge with 82 MPs. Pakatan Nasional, led by Muhyiddin Yassin, has picked up 73 seats. Barisan Nasional, the country's traditional political powerhouse, is trailing with 30 seats. Gabungan Parti Sarawak, or GPS, has 22 seats. These numbers include official and unofficial figures. Now, let's take a look at the possible pathways to forming a government. There are 4 scenarios here. The 2 blocs with the most seats, PH and PN. This seems to be the least likely scenario. PN chief has said the coalition is open to collaborating with any parties except for PH. Next one is PH and BN, and then PN, BN and the Borneo bloc, made out of Gabungan Parti Sarawak, Gabungan Rakyat Sabah and Sabah Barisan Nasional. And the 4th one, PH, the Borneo bloc and Sabah-based Warisan. To some extent, of course, it is a numbers game. Who has enough seats to join with who to get to the simple majority of 112? But ultimately, it is also whether these coalitions find one another palatable and what benefits they will reap from being aligned. And let's discuss all of this. ST's Malaysia Bureau Chief Shannon Teoh joins us from Kuala Lumpur, and with me in the studio is Francis Hutchinson, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Malaysia Studies Programme at the ISEAS, Yusof Ishak Institute. Welcome, Francis and Shannon. Now, Shannon, first, it has been a frenetic day as the various parties jockey to get into place to form the next government. Just tell us what's the latest from out of the capital?
Well, the first thing this morning, what happened was GPS leader, that's the Sarawak Premier, Abang Johari Openg, he flew into Kuala Lumpur to meet with Muhyiddin Yassin. So that set a very clear signal who GPS prefers to be Prime Minister. And in fact, he has issued a statement very clearly saying that his preferred formation of government is to have Pakatan Nasional, that's Muhyiddin Yassin, with BN, with GPS, with GRS, that's a Sabah-based coalition. So he's already set out his stall. And we know that GPS is pretty much the first port of call for most coalitions if you want to get past that mark. And we're talking about Anwar Ibrahim here, obviously he's got 82. If you want to add on to your number of MPs, it's pretty much just BN and GPS, which are the main blocks, right, of MPs that are available. So GPS has already made very clear what it wants to do, and this kind of narrows down the options for Anwar Ibrahim.
Francis, what do you make of that?
So I think if we go back to the outset, many of us were predicting a BN++ coalition. So I think, of course, the surprise has been, as we've seen yesterday, really the real dramatic expansion in Pakatan Nasional's support base. So now it looks like the pathway will be the same, but instead of it being BN++, it will be PN with a BN in a minor subordinate position, along with GPS and GRS, sort of as we had anticipated.
But ironically, while voters had rejected BN, it is now playing the role of a kingmaker. How do you think the electorate will take to that?
So I'm not sure that we can say it's a kingmaker, or perhaps we can say it's influential, but this is a very, very far cry from the BN of old that would be the dominant partner in any coalition. This is a very, very different kettle of fish. And actually, when we go back to the sort of press statement that was released by UMNO Party President Zahid Hamidi yesterday, it was almost sort of sounding magnanimous and sort of issuing an entreaty to be invited to join a coalition. So this is a very, very different position. And when it comes down to sharing of cabinet positions and so on, I think we're going to be in a very different situation from just a few months ago, where BN was very much, again, the dominant party, to very much it being the subordinate partner in any sort of expanded coalition.
Okay, Shannon, if it's a coalition led by PN as announced, are we looking at the return of Muhyiddin as PM?
Yeah, I think generally that's the idea. Muhyiddin is the stated pick for Pakatan Nasional as their Prime Minister candidate. We are not hearing any protests from GPS, from their own partner PAS, even though PAS is now the largest party in Parliament. So that really looks like the pathway forward. If BN does get involved in this coalition, I don't think you're going to see caretaker Prime Minister Ismail Sabri making any kind of protest saying that I should continue as Prime Minister. So there are really pretty much just two options at this point: Muhyiddin Yassin, Anwar Ibrahim.
But does it matter that PAS is the party that has the most number of seats, that won the most number of seats, and not Bersatu?
Well, I think in this case, what's going to happen is that PAS will be able to demand a lot of senior portfolios. I think things like defense may be a very important portfolio. PAS might be able to demand these sort of things. But we're not going to be in a situation where Hadi Awang is going to demand to be Prime Minister. Let's just look at the flip side. In Pakatan Harapan, the largest party is the Democratic Action Party. They are not going to demand to be Prime Minister should PH actually make it across the line. So we're in kind of the same situation. PAS won a lot of seats, but its leader is not considered a mainstream candidate for Prime Minister.
Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I would agree with Shannon. So if we look historically, outside of its heartland of Kelantan and Terengganu, PAS really doesn't poll that well when it contests by itself. Now, when it contests as part of a coalition, you tend to see that its electoral fortunes increase and things, in terms of the votes, in terms of the seats, dramatically improve. So I think that they're quite clear that as long as they have a broad understanding with the other elements of their coalition, they're happy. And if we go to last night, the statement by Muhyiddin Yassin, and you can see Hadi Awang behind him, it was very clear that Hadi Awang, the head of PAS, is influential, but very much Muhyiddin Yassin is the spokesperson. And I think the last data point is that when we come down to opinion surveys, Muhyiddin Yassin consistently polls as one of the most, if not the most, popular senior Malay politicians. And very much it was on the basis of this that Pakatan did very well. If we come to southern parts of the peninsula, you didn't see Hadi Awang. It was very much Muhyiddin Yassin as the figurehead of Pakatan Nasional.
We'll talk about PAS a little bit later on. But coming back to the King's decree, by 2 p.m. tomorrow, he wants a list of potential candidates for Prime Minister. What is the role of the King in all of this? Shannon?
Well, he's the referee, right? He's the judge. He's got to decide which candidate, which MP has is the most likely to command the confidence of the majority of members in Parliament, which is the number 112. We keep talking about the magic number 112, right? So he's got to now kind of decide, and it's usually easy if you have a clear winner. And in the past, this used to be Barisan Nasional. They would always cross the 112 number. In the last election, obviously, Pakatan Harapan won shockingly. They got 113. So there's not much math involved. This time, there's a lot of math involved. No one's got a clear majority. It might come down to a coalition where their numbers might be just across the line. So he's got a huge responsibility on his hands. And recall in 2020, after the so-called Sheraton move, when Pakatan Harapan, their government was toppled by defections, he had to play the same role as a referee to decide who actually can command the confidence in Parliament. And that time, it was a long, drawn-out process. Malaysia was, put into maybe a whole entire week of political and constitutional crisis. This time, I think he's trying to avoid that situation. He wants to get things done early. He wants the party leaders, make your decision, make it clear. I want to know by 2 o'clock tomorrow.
Yes, I agree. So if we look historically, when you have situations when the coalition in power has a very commanding majority, then there's less need or less of a role for the monarch. As Shannon said, it's a figure that is like an umpire, but it's in situations where there's a lack of clarity, a lack of majority. That is where you can see the king or the monarch coming in and playing a very, very important role as an arbiter. So during COVID, following the Sheraton move, following, of course, the transition in power from Muhyiddin to Ismail Sabri, you can see the king playing a very important role as an arbiter, and you can see him here making the determination that it is not in the country's interest to have a long period of a caretaker government or uncertainty. So he's very clear that he's sort of setting the schedule and the milestones for what needs to be determined at what point.
Okay, now one of the big surprises from last night, perhaps the biggest surprise, was seeing Pakatan Nasional take away Malay votes that would have otherwise gone to UMNO. Dubbed the Green Tsunami, it's a reference to Parti Islam Malaysia, or PAS, which is the dominant partner in Pakatan. In fact, PAS is now the party with the most seats in Parliament, 73. The Islamist Party is most popular in the rural Malay belt seats of Kedah and Perlis in the north, and Kelantan and Terengganu in the east. Francis, what do you think happened here?
So I think if we go back in time a few months ago, we look at the state elections in Malacca and in Johor. Actually, some of the research that I've done with my colleagues, we could detect that there was a beginning of a wave for Pakatan Nasional. But I think what took us by surprise, and I think took many people by surprise, was the extent of that wave, right? So it really was a lot bigger than we thought. And so certainly we can see an expansion of PAS out of Kelantan and Terengganu into different parts of Malaysia that traditionally, still in the north, that are not that hospitable to it. So for example, Anwar Ibrahim's daughter Nurul Izzah, she lost her seat, Permatang Pau, to a PAS candidate. Now when you look at it geographically, you can see it's a bit close to Kedah. Now once we come to the middle of the peninsula and in the south, that is very much more Bersatu's terrain. And I think what has happened is that both parties have come together and made a very convincing narrative that I think is, if you like, is pending for the Malaysian electorate. And that is, yes, it's not looking to upset the apple cart. It will continue with many of the country's affirmative action policies, but minus the corruption. And I think that this is very much something that was left pending from 2018, the fact that UMNO hasn't really reformed at all. Consequently, this really left a lot of political space for Pakatan to move into, and of course they had a senior figure like Muhyiddin Yassin to offer the electorate someone that had already been in power. So you have less corruption, continuing with business as usual, and an experienced leader. And I think this is quite a convincing effort.
Shannon, PAS appears to be the alternative to UMNO that Malay voters looked for. Did you expect this?
Well, no, I mean, we did expect a rebalancing in that sense that UMNO's numbers or Barisan Nasional's numbers would come down a bit and Pakatan Nasional's would come up a bit higher, but we didn't expect it to be this high. And for a very long time last night, they were threatening to actually be the largest bloc. So it is an incredibly surprising performance. But I just want to say that, and I agree with Francis, the point he was making earlier, there is a sense of PAS making these gains, but riding on the coattails of Muhyiddin Yassin. So they've made a lot of gains in areas which they don't normally win in. And part of it is that, you might say that they are hiding or they're riding behind Muhyiddin Yassin's shadow. And a lot of their candidates in certain areas where they would not have normally won if they were just running on their own. But thanks to Muhyiddin Yassin's popularity and also the sense that Bersatu is going to have a moderating effect on PAS, right? So then you can actually get a lot of, moderate Malays, more liberal Malays, they might even still go with the Bersatu or the PAS candidate in their areas. Now, so what I'm trying to get at is that, terms like green tsunami is very compelling. It makes for a great narrative. But I think there's a bit of scaremongering involved here, that as if PAS is going to take over the country and it's going to become an Islamic theocracy. I don't think that's in play at all, and that's why you've been seeing Hadi trying not to play too much of a role in the center stage, trying to be very secondary to Muhyiddin Yassin. And so the messaging is very clear here. It's still a coalition of parties, a multiracial coalition, even though Gerakan didn't do well, the smaller parties didn't do well. But they're setting out their stall to say that, look, this is not an Islamist coalition. We have an Islamist party, they have their certain ideas, but when you go into a coalition, especially if you're trying to get GPS from Sarawak involved, and in Sarawak, they're relatively a lot more progressive than in Peninsula. The coalition and the policies they're going to put forward, it has to be quite moderate still.
I see you nodding there, Francis. So you agree with Francis that, with Shannon, that it's not going to be a more conservative Malaysia down the road?
So, I mean, I think perhaps in the very long term, we are seeing a bit more of a move in a conservative direction. I think, opinion surveys show that younger Malaysians tend to be more religiously conservative. But I do agree with Shannon that I don't think this is, a tsunami is not necessarily the best way to see it. I think another couple of data points along the same discussion, Bersatu actually is a multiracial party itself. So it's got an associate members wing. Just to give you an idea, in Johor, Bersatu contested 20 seats, of which 4 were contested by its non-Malay members wing in ethnic and ethnically mixed constituencies. So it does see itself that way, and so when people are voting for it, they are seeing exactly PAS at one level, but you do have a certain constraining influence around it. And I think there's also another data point, which is that when we go back to 2008, 2013, how did people in the northern part of Malaysia vote if they wanted an alternative? They voted for PAS. And let's remember, PAS was part of Pakatan Rakyat. And so when you have the falling apart of Pakatan Rakyat, you have PAS leaving. Nonetheless, I think for many people, when they want to vote for a change, that is who they vote for. So I think we must see it as well as a vote against something as well as a vote for something.
Now, speaking about voting for change, now after 6 decades of governing the country, UMNO's bid to continue to stay in power ended in crushing disappointment. Not only did it fail to win, but it also suffered its worst defeat in its history, with only 30 seats, miles behind the 2 other coalitions in the election race. Among some key UMNO figures who lost their seats was Tengku Zafrul Aziz, Malaysia's most recent finance minister. He failed against Pakatan Harapan's Zulkifli Ahmad, who retained the Kuala Selangor seat. Another high-profile casualty was Khairi Jamaluddin, Malaysia's outgoing and popular health minister. Mr. Jamaluddin failed to flip the Sungai Buloh seat from Pakatan Harapan in a fierce 7-cornered battle. Now, even UMNO President Zahid Hamidi, who had pressed for this GE to be held during flood season, won Bagan Datuk by a very, very narrow margin, right? What do you make of the dismal results? Maybe, Francis, you start.
So, a bit as we were discussing just now, I think that this is really the unresolved issue arising out of 2018. So we have BN being defeated, right? Incredibly. And funnily enough, there is no internal reform, no questioning, no cleansing. No one sits down to say, why did we lose? Where did we go wrong? So yes, of course, Najib Razak stepped down, but then you very much had the same sort of cohort of people in the highest positions in UMNO continuing with business as usual. And as a matter of fact, when you think about the narrative that they wanted to come back on, it's we want to regain our rightful place in power. We want to have a coalition and a majority by ourselves. Now, when you think about, why they lost, this is not at all a compelling narrative. And I think a lot of people got sort of distracted by the whole Bosco phenomenon, the, online rehabilitation of Najib and all the rest. And then, yes, of course, he would show up at different places and you'd have the party faithful come out. But when you look at where they were making electoral inroads, they weren't. They had the same voting base that they had in 2018. It didn't grow at all. And then on top of that, you have these very personalized, sort of very strange strategic decisions to drop someone like Shahid and Qasim, who has very much a very extensive power base in Perlis, that of course then he goes across to Pakatan Nasional and he takes his whole state with him. So it's these sort of very strange strategic decisions that I think cost UMNO many more seats than would have otherwise been the case.
Now, Shannon, Zahid is facing widespread calls from his party to step down as UMNO chief. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think he's likely to do it?
Well, we know that he's fighting tooth and nail to stay on, and who really wants to leave the position as party president and chairman of the coalition. But we saw that happening with Najib Razak in 2018. Immediately after the defeat, there was a huge push for Najib to vacate the leadership. And we are seeing again this thing happening right now. But maybe it's not as strong an impetus because you have to compare the relative change in position. Najib presided over Barisan Nasional's and UMNO's first ever defeat. In this case, they are defeated, the worst ever defeat. I mean, they finished third out of the three main coalitions. But I don't think the expectation in the first place was they were going to win, that they were going to form a simple majority in the first place. So the shock factor here isn't as high. Still, we know that from the UMNO meeting that was held earlier today about this afternoon, the political bureau, well, there was a fair bit of opinions being thrown about whether Zahid should stay, should he go? And we know that later subsequent meetings were cancelled. The UMNO Supreme Council meeting, a Barisan Nasional Supreme Council meeting, they were also cancelled and postponed. So this is a party now at odds with itself. There's clearly at least two camps here. One, Zahid, which wants to ally with Pakatan Harapan, and the other segment of the party wants to go with Pakatan Nasional. So this has got to be sorted out, as the King says, by 2 o'clock tomorrow. But this is driving a huge wedge into the party, and if they want to rebound from this, they've got to sort it out soon.
Francis, what do you think this will mean in the longer term? People are looking for change, and UMNO has been in power for over 6 decades, and yet it could still be part of a governing coalition.
Yeah, so I think when we look back at 2018, I think many of us thought that it was like a clean transition. And I think the reality is that countries and political processes move in a more incremental way. So if you actually look at it, maybe you take a step back, they lost after 61 years, then they came back as a partner in a coalition. Over time, they got a better position. Now, if you like, they're going to be on the back foot and they'll have a more submissive position, a less dominant position, if at all. And then if we go forward in the next few months, I would hypothesize that if Zahid Hamidi doesn't resign now, when they have elections in a few months' time, he will certainly be challenged. So it could well be that, yes, he hangs on for a few months, but then he's ultimately defeated. And then there could be a generational change, a cultural change in UMNO. But yeah, so back to your point, I think it's not about big ruptures, it's more about slower processes and I guess more gradual change.
Shannon, do you share those sentiments?
Well, I mean, that's how a party like UMNO works, right? There's a lot of feudalism involved. When you want your elder leaders to leave, you hope that they leave nicely, like what happened to Abdullah Badawi after 2008. That was the first time Barisan Nasional lost his customary two-thirds supermajority. They kind of eased him out the door. That kind of gentlemanly behavior has kind of eased the way as their performances have gotten worse and worse since then. But I think that UMNO does have to do something really tangible, really drastic, whether now or in a few months during their party elections, which they has to be held within 6 months of now. Look, I mean, we talked about green tsunami, so on and so forth. How did PAS do so well? How did Pakatan do so well? But I know it's about options, right? It's about relative options. Voters were presented an option between a Zahid-led coalition and a Muhyiddin-led coalition. It kind of made things very easy for Muhyiddin because on the one hand, you have a guy who has graft trials, right? Zahid is probably facing a verdict by early next year. He's wanting parliament to be dissolved even though there are floods coming up, so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have Muhyiddin who, at least among younger voters, has really cultivated this image that, you know, in 2015, you know what happened to me? I was Deputy Prime Minister, but I was sacked because I fought the 1MDB scandal. You know, last year in 2021, I was the Prime Minister, but I also lost my job again because I didn't want to interfere in the court cases of Zahid, of Najib, so on and so forth. So it became a very easy, very clear-cut differentiation for voters. UMNO's got to do something about this.
Okay, let's talk about another coalition, Pakatan Harapan. Anwar Ibrahim's coalition may have been the best performer in this election, clinching 82 seats. But as we heard earlier, it seems highly doubtful that it can form a majority government. That also puts paid to Mr. Anwar's 25-year dream of becoming PM. Now, in the constituency that he was running for, Mr. Anwar scored a comfortable win over incumbent and PN's Deputy Chairman Faisal Azumu in the closely watched battle for Tambun in Perak. It was the first time Mr. Anwar was contesting a seat there. Now, Shannon, Malay voters rejected UMNO, a Malay-based party that's dogged by corruption. Would it be accurate to say that they have also rejected PH, despite its reform agenda and longer track record?
Well, I think when you look at the Malay voter split, yeah, it's probably going to be true. I mean, we have to wait for the data to come out, but I think it's probably true that Pakatan Harapan probably won the least number of Malay votes among the three main coalitions. But I don't think that this was a rejection based on corruption or what they thought about Pakatan Harapan's leaders per se. But there is this very deep-seated skepticism over Pakatan Harapan. There's been a lot of race-based, ethnocentric rhetoric over maybe the past 15 years about basically alleging that the DAP, the Democratic Action Party, and in fact Anwar as a kind of co-conspirator or a cat's paw, so if you allow, that they want to kind of undermine Bumiputra interests, the position of Islam in the country, so on and so forth. So it is kind of the flip side. On the one hand, we have a segment of voters kind of afraid of this rise of PAS as an Islamic theocracy. And then you have to also understand on the other side of the mirror, you have a segment of voters who are afraid of this over-secularization, over-liberalization of Malaysia's government.
Francis, it does really seem like race-based voting remains very much entrenched in Malaysia. If that's the case, what kind of a future can a multi-ethnic party like PH play?
So I think that there's a structural reality. So many people, immediately sort of start thinking about psychology. People think this way, people from one ethnic community think another way. But if we look at the design of Malaysia's electoral system, you have MPs that govern in a certain constituency. And there is a broad correlation between the ethnicity and where it is located. So basically, if you look at peninsular Malaysia, you draw a line sort of down the middle roughly, and you look on the right, you look on the left. On the left is going to be much more multi-ethnic, more urban constituencies. If you look on the right, they are less populated, more rural, more Malay majority constituencies. And you have something called malapportionment, which basically means that these constituencies with fewer people have the same number, number of parliamentarians, one MP. So you can have one constituency with 40,000 people, have one MP, and one constituency with 150,000 people, also you have one MP. So you have 117 of these rural Malay majority constituencies. So if you're ambitious and you want to basically make quick wins, it is more logical and more rational for you to cater to this community first, to get as many of these 117 seats as you can, and then from there you start looking at rural, urban areas, and you start looking across to Sabah and Sarawak. Now, so this is what has happened, and this is why you have UMNO and Bersatu and PAS contesting in these 117 seats. Now, PH's problem is that they're very successful, almost 100% successful in your urban mixed constituencies. They get 96% of them. But they have a real problem when it comes to moving into this other area. So they are constrained. So their multi-ethnic brand of politics is difficult. So you can see them really making inroads when they had Bersatu, when they had Muhyiddin, when they had Mahathir, that allows them to expand into this area. So unless that they can come up with a narrative or a leader that is convincing to some of these seats, these 117 seats, it is difficult for them. And one thing, if I can complement Shannon's discussion on Anwar, I think also in addition to the sort of narrative about DAP and so forth, I think voters also question who he is. So if we look back in time, he began in ABIM, which is of course an Islamic student organization. Then he was in UMNO for a very long time. And then only when things went bad for him did he then move into the opposition. So the question is also, who is he? And if you vote for him, what will you get? So I do think that casts some doubt. And then you have the other issue that, of course, he's a very respectable figure, but he's 75. And we have an electorate that is also very young now, right? Disproportionately. So is he someone that can have that message? And so I think when you look at some of the younger figures, Rafizi Ramli and so forth, there does seem to be more receptiveness. And I have met people that have said, you know what, if we had a different leader in Pakatan Harapan, we would be more comfortable.
Now, Shannon, you've been covering this election since nomination day, and even before that, really. We have seen thousands throng Mr. Anwar Ibrahim's rallies. Do you think that they are not confident that he'll be a good Prime Minister? The people who go to those rallies.
I mean, Anwar's got, plenty of supporters. I mean, if you're going to look at the vote share, right, between the three coalitions, it is going to be very likely that Pakatan Harapan got the most votes, right? More Malaysians voted for Pakatan Harapan than any other coalition. That's likely the result that you're going to see. But when you look at what Francis mentioned, the malapportionment, the gerrymandering, if you win a seat like Bangi has 300,000 voters, you get one MP. If you win a seat, I think it was Saratok in Sarawak, it's less than 30,000 voters, you get one MP. So that's one of the issues here. It's a higher return on investment if you kind of go for as Francis mentioned, the kind of Malay rural voter, right? You just have to convince a few 10,000, 20,000 voters, you get an MP in. You want to convince urban voters to vote for you, that's 100, 150,000 voters that you need to convince maybe. So we are in this situation where Pakatan Harapan has a very strong base, and you don't want to give up that base. But if you want to make the gains that are necessary for you to govern on your own without needing to try and attract a partner, and in this case, what we've seen is that most of the other coalitions don't want to partner with Anwar Ibrahim. They don't want to partner with Pakatan Harapan. You've got to try and figure out a way to cross that number 112. But there is a demographic situation here, right? That 73% of Malaysians, I think in the last statistics, live in urban areas or suburban areas. And in fact, there's a lot of urban migration. I suppose if you actually go out to the rural areas and if you try to figure out, do all the voters who are registered here actually live here? Probably not. I think you'll find that maybe 20–30% actually live in the city, they work in the city, and then they come back and vote. And that proportion is going to keep growing higher and higher and higher. I'm not saying that Pakatan Harapan doesn't have to do anything. Just sit back and for the next 10 or 20 years, something magical is going to happen to the demographics and then you're going to take power. You still have to do something. But what I'm saying is that they are going to slowly kind of, chip away at the margins. Now, just want to remind that in 2018, we weren't talking about Pakatan Harapan not being able to get Malay voters, so on and so forth. But they won less than 23% of the Malay vote in 2018. I'm not sure what their number is going to come up to this time. Probably be slightly under 20%, but it's not that far away. And that 3 or 4 percentage points can be all the difference between victory or defeat.
All right, now it's been an eventful election season with a number of surprises, but one of the more talked about upsets comes from a very familiar name. Former Premier Mahathir Mohamad has lost his seat and election deposit in Parliament after 5 decades. It is the 97-year-old's first defeat in Malaysia's parliamentary elections since he lost in 1969. This after residents of Langkawi voted to put Perikatan Nasional in control of the island constituency. The Langkawi seat was won by Datuk Suhaimi Abdullah from Perikatan Nasional with 38.1% of the vote share. Now, it's a rather humbling defeat for the man who was Malaysia's longest-serving Prime Minister and also the father of modern Malaysia. The outcome in Langkawi must be especially painful, given that he was so instrumental in the development of Langkawi as a tourist destination. Francis, what do you make of it?
So yes, I think it's an end of an era, a beginning of a new one. I think if you look other figures like Tengku Razali Hamzah, also Taufik Ismail, the son of Tun Dr. Ismail, they also lost their seats, or in the case of Taufik Ismail, he didn't win his seat, he was contesting against Zahid Hamidi. And I think we can see that there is a kind of move away from some of these older figures, and I think that the electorate is after younger, different figures that also perhaps have a different way of interacting with voters. I think that's one thing. The other thing is, though, I think when we look at Dr. Mahathir's career, we sort of see that he's very visionary, he has a lot of ideas, but he's, how can I say, he's not maybe the best team player. And so what you see is over time, the organizations that he is associated with get progressively smaller. And at the end, he was the head of a very, very small party, and he met this demise. So I think this speaks to, the need to have a team around you, to listen, to evolve, and also you do have generational changes in politics.
Shannon, what about yourself? Does it spell the end of an era in Malaysian politics?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a lot of the past, maybe 3 up to 4 decades of Malaysian politics has been kind of a story of the Mahathir versus Anwar kind of tussle, right? Or even a tussle between proxies sometimes. Since the 90s, Anwar has been trying to become Prime Minister. He's still trying now. We are still not sure if he's going to succeed by tomorrow. But that's been the story, right? And that's kind of also the reason. That's what precipitated the situation we find ourselves in today. Mahathir in charge of a very small party, a very small coalition, because of all this enmity between his camp and Anwar's camp, when they actually created history, winning in 2018 together under Pakatan Harapan. Look, I mean, if you think about how much influence that Mahathir has, right? Let's go back to the point that it was about the few percentage points increase, right, in Malay votes that probably Mahathir and his other leaders in Bersatu provided to Pakatan Harapan in 2018 that got them across the line. You take those few percentage points away and then suddenly you've only got 80 MPs. But those few percentage points are not enough for Mahathir to do anything with on his own, right? Malaysia is still very strongly entrenched in the idea of coalition politics. Just because you're a big personality and you go and contest in a certain seat doesn't mean that you're going to win just because of who you are, how famous you are, and how much people respect you. I'm actually pretty sure people in Langkawi still respect Mahathir. But just giving him the seat was not enough. What was Mahathir's party, Pejuang, going to do with this one seat? If people really wanted to vote for a winner, if you wanted to vote for a change, then you have to vote for Pakatan to be in power, you have to vote for Pakatan to be in power, you have to vote, maybe you don't want change, then you have to vote for Barisan Nasional to be in power, right? There was no chance from the outset of Pejuang forming government. Or in fact, even Mahathir, he was entertaining this idea of returning as Prime Minister. So I think that's a situation that we find ourselves in with regards to Malaysia's longest serving former Prime Minister. I think there's still widespread respect, but the message is that I think your time is done. It is an end of an era. You have to let, quote unquote, the younger ones sort it out, but by younger we mean people in their 70s rather than 90s. And there is a kind of a generational shift. So we have to remember what Mahathir has done in this country, for this country, but I think there is a clear signal that we need to move on.
You'd like to add on to
Sure.
that?
Thank you. And just to add on to what Shannon is saying, I think also it shows that voters can actually be quite sophisticated. So one of the structural problems that you have in Malaysia is that if you're an opposition MP, usually you are denied constituency development funds. This means as an MP, you don't have the same funds for bridges and roads and projects in your constituency that people in the ruling coalition do. So clearly, I think the voters, and let's remember Langkawi is focused on tourism. We've had COVID, very, very difficult economic situation for them. They're making a rational calculation. Is my MP likely or not to be in the ruling coalition? Could BN be in power? Mahathir doesn't work with them. Could Pakatan Harapan be in power? Mahathir doesn't work with them either. So then are we going to spend the next 5 years starved of development funds for our constituency? So I think that that was another layer in this decision.
Now, G15 certainly marks the beginning of a new type of coalition politics. It's early days yet, but how stable do you think things will be? A government cobbled by various different parties.
So I think when we come at this question, one thing is, if you've been looking at Malaysia for a very long time, you are used to stability, you are used to not a lot of change, you're used to the same faces, you're used to 22 or 10 or 9-year tenures where not a lot changes. I don't think that is necessarily representative of many countries, and in that sense I think Malaysia is now joining many democracies where coalition politics take pride of place, and that's how you do business. Now, I think anti-party hopping has helped, because what this means is you don't have a government fall because of 1 or 2 or 3 lawmakers crossing the floor, as has been the case in the past. But we still are facing a very diverse country where it's actually difficult, because of your different interest groups, because of the different demographics, to come up with a ruling coalition. So it is likely, as we're seeing, that your coalitions will have to reconfigure, and your parties may leave coalitions and join others. And this is actually allowed by the anti-party hopping law. So I would say, yes, let's get ready for a period of quite a lot of change, but that's the situation in many countries.
Any last thoughts, Shannon?
Well, I mean, I think Francis has brought up that point of the anti-party hopping law quite succinctly, that it does give you a bit more stability in Malaysia. But I think the question also, and then Francis has also mentioned, is stability really the be-all and end-all of an election? Is that really the point of an election? In which case, was Malaysia better off in the days of 2/3 supermajorities for Barisan Nasional, right? I mean, that's a separate kind of question. But if you want to develop as a democracy, you have to be ready that the election is going to throw up all sorts of results, and that people aren't going to vote like you. I know there's a lot of angst here in Kuala Lumpur a lot of people are wondering what just happened, you know, why do we even have this election if it's going to throw out a result which, you know, a lot of people feel like it's going back to square one, right? We are going to very likely have a coalition government that was made up of the same characters as before October 10 when we dissolved parliament. So what was the point of this entire process? But it proves that Malaysians are diverse. We vote for many different parties. And now it's up to these parties, these political leaders, to come together, find common ground, and roll out a set of policies that will benefit the majority of Malaysians, possibly, and also their own political agendas, right? You might notice that in the past 2 years since PAS has been part of the federal government, there's been nary a peep about, you know, Islamic law and hudud and all this kind of stuff, which were they were espousing while they were in opposition. They were very strongly talking about things like hudud then. They stopped talking about it once they were in government because there's this kind of realization that my governing partners are not going to like us talking about this. We should focus on joint policy, things that we have agreed on that is going to be the policy of this government. So I think that's the hope for Malaysians moving forward, that, you know, you're going to have other Malaysians vote for extremely different ideologies, but once you have to form a coalition government of many different parties with different ideas, it all has to be moderated and everyone has to come back towards the center.
Now, I have one last point to make before we go. DAP veteran Lim Kit Siang is actually urging for a PH, PN and a Borneo Bloc coalition, you know, in his Make Malaysia Great Again, you know, ideal. What do you make of that?
Before we get to that, can I just add 2 points to what Shannon was saying? Actually, I think that Malaysian voters are very sophisticated, and I would like to highlight 2 things. The first is, you know, there's been some polarization and so forth, but there has been no violence. There's been no electoral violence, number 1. And number 2, while all of us are here trying to figure out the context and the contours of the next government, no one has said that the elections are rigged. No one has sought to delegitimize the electoral process. And I think in this context, I think that is so laudable and so, I think, very, very positive and speaks well about the electorate. Now, coming back to Lim Kit Siang's roadmap, I mean, it sounds nice, but I think we have to accept that PN has a greater disposition to work with other partners, and they have, and even just last night, of course, Muhyiddin Yassin was saying that, you know, working with PH is not on the table. So I do see it as difficult. It seems, as Shannon has mentioned, that the other components of this Rainbow Coalition work together better, more seamless, and they've actually had greater experience working with each other. So it does seem to be that is the more likely configuration.
Shannon, very quickly, do you want to wrap up on that note?
Yeah, I mean, in all likelihood, if we see this, everyone but Pakatan government, there is still a role for Pakatan, right? We've seen that while they were in opposition over the last 2 years, they had a role to play as a strong opposition. And in fact, as there were questions about government stability, they were able to come in with a confidence and supply agreement and actually push a lot of reforms, a lot of legislation and policies, which, you know, in fact, they couldn't push through while they were in government. So, you know, a weak government, quote unquote, a weak government, unstable coalition isn't always a bad thing. I think that's the point I was trying to make with my previous answer as well. It actually creates opportunities for very unique, very creative policy solutions, and actually brings a lot of legislation, a lot of new policies forward. There are opportunities in the chaos, so to speak.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on to that. You know, if we go back to the days when Barisan Nasional had such a commanding majority, you know, you didn't have equal constituency allocation for opposition MPs. You know, the whole issue of Undi 18, the whole issue of automatic voter registration was not on the map. Anti-party hopping was not on the map. And now, as we've seen the parliamentary majorities decrease and come to, shall we say, 60%, 55%, just over 50%, all of a sudden, your MPs that are in power suddenly begin to think, well, you know what? Tomorrow I may not be in power. And how am I going to service my constituents? I'm going to be an opposition MP, but I need to be re-elected, so I need to have funds to work with. So all of a sudden the mentality changes. So yes, I completely agree that having a strong opposition now, 82, you know, they've shown that they are part of the political system. They have performed well in 2018. There's been perhaps a smaller haul of seats, but it is still very considerable. And also, this goes to show that if one of the coalitions is unhappy, or one of the parties in the governing coalition, that you could have a change somewhere down the track in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So I think that this kind of changes the behavior of people as well.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your perspectives and insights. ST's Malaysia Bureau Chief, Shannon Teoh in Kuala Lumpur, and my many thanks to my studio guest here, Francis Hutchinson, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Malaysia Studies Programme at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. And our coverage of Malaysia's general election continues on straitstimes.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe to stay informed and activate the bell icon on YouTube to catch live news updates. I'm Lynlee Foo. Thanks for watching.